always make the joke that for a first-time manager trying to, read up on how to be a better manager, you better buy a neck brace because you are going to get whiplash from all the contradictory advice out there. And so I think the first step is to understand leadership is hard because it is a series of these paradoxes. I think the next step is to then realize these are not or propositions, they are and. It's not one or the other. You have to do both, but you have to know what the right response is in the context at the moment. And I try and simplify just because I have a small brain, like use a lot of metaphors and visuals. And to me, I think about a unicycle, and that's what you have to be as a leader. You have to understand the balance point between all these contradictions.
All right, welcome back to the Better Human podcast. Today we have got Adam Bryant, who's senior manager and director of a company called Exco Group, very similar to the work that I do in regards to leadership development and executive coaching. But Adam, you have spent your career learning leadership, interviewing leaders, CEOs, really discovering what it is to be a leader. What are those traits? What's the difference between manager to leader? So we'll geek out today. That's a big topic. Leaders have a lot of pressure on themselves today. I mean, we're leading in this weird sort of fragmented world today. We're coming out of this, hybrid world back into the office. We're always going through this change. And I think if you look at what I was saying this a little earlier to a group, sometimes as leaders, what we need to do is make the decision first, or, make the decisions that no one else is willing to make, or make those calls or have those conversations. And we're living in times right now where I think that is very apparent, right, in regard to companies. So on that note, Adam Bryant, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Greg. Appreciate it.
Adam, I want to kick off with your new book. So for the audience, by the way, Adam is like an author, right? Like if you want to go check out some of his work, he's written 4 books, right? The first book was called The Corner Office, Indispensable and Unexpected Lessons from CEOs on How to Lead and Succeed, which is, I think I love the name of the book as well, that corner office. It really speaks to sort of that traditional leadership. But we're now moving into this world, and your latest book is called The Leap to Leader: How Ambitious Managers Make the Jump to Leadership. So let's kick off with this. You've been published by Harvard Business Review, which is super exciting. I read that all the time. Let's talk about, let me ask you this first question. So in today's times, current world, businesses, what do you think leaders' biggest challenges that they're facing in today's climate?
I think it's all just the uncertainty, the disruption, and with the rise of stakeholder capitalism, and just there's been, to me, these kind of some tsunamis of change that have rolled over the corporate landscape and redefining the meaning of work, the future of work, what leadership is. We're hearing all these new words that leaders are supposed to be human, authentic, vulnerable. I think there's a lot of conversations that not only leaders, but managers are having to have with employees that they aren't necessarily prepared for. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of tough new balancing acts for managers, leaders, and companies. How do you be compassionate in this day and age when a lot of people need that compassion, yet also hold people accountable for performance? How do you create a culture where people feel like there is that inclusion, there is that sense of belonging, and yet at the same time create a culture where you are very clear about what you stand for and what you do not stand for? Mm-hmm. So I think there's all these cross currents, these paradoxes, these contradictions that in my mind have made leadership, pick a number, 5 to 10 times harder just in the last few years.
Yeah. You almost wonder why people want to become leaders.
Exactly. And it does take a certain wiring, a certain mindset. I think there's some drive and stamina that needs there. And by now I've interviewed more than 1,000 CEOs and other senior leaders with a very specific focus of never asking them a single question about their company or their strategy, and all about leadership lessons they've learned and what influenced them and what shaped them as a leader. And to me, I'm so intrigued about where people get that drive from, because you and I know, you look at on paper what these top jobs are, and like, why would anybody ever want those? And so I always try and get under the hood a little bit and try and understand where that drive comes from.
Yeah, I'm going to jump into that because I'd love to hear what some of those common answers are. You said something earlier, which is, one of the things that we have to go through today is uncertainty. And one of the things that the human being does not do well is deal with uncertainty. In fact, we are built to operate with certainty. It's why we follow the patterns and the routines that we do. It's why we're habitual in our habits. And we're living in the sea of change, which throws people into this sort of abyss of uncertainty and discomfort. And leaders having to live in that world and be able to manage it, I think, is a massive challenge. But you also said something interesting, which is, in today's world, there's a lot of pressure on the vulnerability, the coaching, the human, the warmth, the encouraging, the enrolling, the participating, the working the human being. Yet, there's a contradiction from the business need, which is we need to hold people accountable and manage the business and drive performance. And there's a tug of war between that, right? How do I live between both worlds? How do I live in this humane leadership as well as look after the health and the performance of the business? What are your thoughts to that? I mean, do you see that as the tug of war? And maybe what are some of the quick tips or answers that we can do to manage that tug of war effectively as leaders?
Sure. And I think the first step is to understand that there are those paradoxes. I mean, the reason leadership is so hard is because you could just line them up in pairs, all these contradictions, these paradoxes. I always make the joke that for a first-time manager trying to, read up on how to be a better manager, you better buy a neck brace because you are going to get whiplash from all the contradictory advice out there, right? And so I think the first step is to understand leadership is hard because it is a series of these paradoxes. I think the next step is to then realize these are not or propositions, they are and. It's not one or the other. You have to do both, but you have to know what the right response is in the context at the moment. And I try and simplify just because I have a small brain, like use a lot of metaphors and visuals. And to me, I think about a unicycle, and that's what you have to be as leader. You have to understand the balance point between all these contradictions and know which way to flex in any given moment. So you might be in a meeting with an employee where you've got to be compassionate. They're going through a lot at home. And that's the right response to a high-performing employee. And so that's the right response. 10 minutes later, you could be in a meeting where you kind of need to pound the table a little bit because somebody is not performing as they're expected to. And you've got to send a strong message to them. And you can be both. So I'm always skeptical of people often like to put a word in front of the word leadership, some adjective, positive leadership, compassionate leadership. Their entire industry is built around that impulse. And I'm always a bit skeptical because I think leadership is leadership. And just by putting a word in front of it tends to oversimplify what is a very complicated challenge.
Correct. What I hear a lot lately is facilitative leadership.
Right? And we could talk all day about servant leadership. I've got opinions there too.
Right. And these are all great sort of concepts. Servant leadership, what was his name? It was it's escaping me for a sec. But I mean, there's points to it, but it's not the end all and the be all. And I think, we say this a lot when it comes down to the work that we do. I think the danger with leadership today is we're so overloaded with learning, reading books, doing courses, that becomes the exercise in itself. People go and they do the course, they read the book, they listen to the podcast, and they go, that's it. I'm good. Right? I participated. But it's the actioning of all this stuff. So I'm really curious. So you've interviewed over 1,000 CEOs and leaders. What are some of the common questions you ask, and what are some of the common answers you get?
When I started this, the Corner Office series at the New York Times in 2009, and I left the Times about 6 years to join my current firm, the XCO Group. But I'm still doing interviews. I've got 4 interview series on LinkedIn with board directors, CEOs, CHROs. And I've never strayed from my swim lane, if you will, of I never ask a single question about company strategy or industry dynamics. It's all about leadership lessons learned. And the cool thing about doing interviews, and you find this too, I'm sure, it gives you a chance to hit the reset button and try out different questions and see what works and what leads to insights or not. So when I first started doing this, I was trying out a bunch of questions, but ultimately I tend to start my interviews, and I always want to focus on, just like, let's go back to when you were a kid. Like, what are the early influences that really shaped who you are as a leader today, where you get your values from? What were you doing outside of class when you were in middle school and high school? tell me about your parents or whoever raised you. How did they influence your leadership style today? And very often, if the person has sort of an open, honest, candid approach to life, and they give me answers, I find with those three questions, you feel like, okay, I get you, right? Like I feel like I get about 85% of you, because let's face it, I mean, the concrete's wet when we're young, right? And those early influence really shape us. Just through those stories I've heard, I mean, I have a database, if you will. It's qualitative more than quantitative, but just through the patterns of answers that I've heard. I mean, if you step back and ask the question, why do people do these jobs that are so impossible and getting even harder? I think one big category is people have faced a lot of adversity when they were younger. Not to try and overshrink or anything like that, but I think when you face that kind of adversity, you may feel like you want a bit more control over your environment and over your life. And as just one very quick example, I had this moment where I interviewed two CEOs back to back. They told me the exact same story. They were growing up, younger, comfortable, middle-class family. Father worked, mother stayed at home. Father didn't have life insurance and died at a relatively young age from a heart attack. Right. In both situations, the family suddenly had to scramble to keep food on the table and the lights on. And both the CEOs, it was so strange. They said literally the same thing. They said, I never wanted to put my own family in that position.
Right.
And so you ask yourself, where does that drive come from? That, because let's face it, these top jobs, there's 3-shift jobs, right? There's the morning email session, there's a full day at work, and then there's a full night shift where you're reading and responding to emails and doing the work that you can't do at work, right? So where does that drive come from? Right. Another big pattern I saw was some version of the immigrant story where somebody in their family was always doing something for the first time in their family, right? The first to go to college, the first to do this. And I think when you spend your entire life on that path of doing something for the first time, that actually becomes your comfort zone. And you need to, that's kind of what leadership requires. And, a third category I'd say broadly is just people who hit kind of the parent lottery, right? Like they've got great family, great parents. And usually there's an interesting yin and yang of the parents, like an engineer, an artist, or the entrepreneur, psychologist. And then a fourth category of people who just seem to be born with so much darn energy, and business is just a vehicle for manifesting that energy.
Right. Thinking about my story, my story was grew up in a lot of, call it adversity, very challenging father, very intense in regard to an entrepreneur as well. In fact, he started the business, and that's kind of how I fell into it, not willing, more forced to show up for a summer job. Had to step into this role, right? Which was the first time it's like, whoa, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And I get it. I like what you said there, which is, also that third piece, which is, that immigrant sort of story, which is first. I think leadership is about being first.
Yeah.
And we were talking about that earlier. First to make decisions, first to have the conversation, first to take the risk. I think in all of the categories you just described, there's a risk element there, right? Which is, without moving forward in that role, that position, that responsibility, the risk is greater than the outcome or reward.
Yeah. And I feel like, just to build on that, I mean, the last few years, we are seeing in our work, it's really kind of separated leaders because, again, the job, I think, pick a number, 5 to 10 times harder. There's a lot of people who are coming up and, headed to the C-suite, maybe around 50 years old. And we're seeing this a lot. People are just like, I'm out. Like that job that I'm headed for, that's not what I signed up for. And I think in this day and age, and again, to use a different metaphor, I think being like a C-suite leader right now feels like every day somebody's handing you a Rubik's Cube you've never seen before. And there's a mountain of them waiting for you, like just new ones every single day. And I think you either need to like that or not, right? Because if you don't like it, it's just going to feel overwhelming and draining. But I've talked to so many leaders who are really excited by it. Say, what an amazing time to be in business and leadership when we're trying to figure out like what the next generation of workplaces looks like. So you gotta be excited by that sort of roaring fire of change rather than wanting to run away from it.
Yeah. You mentioned generations. I want to go there for a sec. You see difference in generational leadership Like, once upon a time, a few years ago, the generation was a big topic, right? Like, generational leadership. Is there a difference? Have you seen it in your interviews and experience with people?
I think, to me, the generational question, I mean, if you got 5 more hours, right, we could talk about quiet quitting and the great resignation and what that means. And, I have, when quiet quitting first burst onto the scene as a hashtag, I think it was felt like May or something. And I saw that, I go like, is that going to last like 2 weeks? And of course it keeps going, right? And so I kind of made it my side project to talk to as many people who are much younger than me to say, what does this mean to you? Like, what is really going on? The big insight for me is that quiet quitting has a branding problem because it's not about quitting. What it's really about is people say they want boundaries between work and life. And I think when so many people were working at home, work just kind of blurred into night. And so I think there's a feeling of like, okay, we need boundaries, and B, like, I'm not going to kill myself because I'm not seeing the ROI there, right? Like I want more of a guarantee rather than just putting in 20 hours and, not getting anything for it. And so you step back, and what I think is happening right now at a macro level is that companies and employers and employees are trying to figure out the informal social contract of what work means right now. And I feel like with the Great Resignation, companies have, done a lot. Like, okay, remote work, and we'll do these benefits, and whatever you need, we'll give it to you. And the employees had a lot of leverage. And now feels to me like we're trying to find that right balance point, because with some of the leaders we talk to, there is a little bit of frustration, I will say, and they're quite open about it. It's like, we feel that we're making a pretty good effort to be accommodating and create these flexible environments, but they're not necessarily seeing the sort of give and take on the other side. Right. And so to me, that's like, where is this all going to settle out? Or is it just going to be the historical notion of, is it employers, market, or employees, buyers or sellers? Who's got the leverage? That's traditionally way this discussion has been framed. Can we get to a place where everybody feels like it's in balance? I don't know.
Right. I think people have the wrong call it definition of balance. The whole conversation of work-life balance. I think it's the wrong conversation. I think having balance in general, being able to adapt and adjust and ebb and flow between my professional goals and needs and requirements and expectations, which also has a lot to do with what I want to achieve in my career. I think this is the missing piece of the conversation. It's always about, that balance. Well, hold on a second. It's what you were talking about before. One of the categories that you've seen, which, leaders rise to the occasion and into these roles, are people that have come through adversity. Like they've had to push through that resistance. That's a little bit around your career as well, which I want to remind people that, as I'm sure you appreciate the saying, nothing in life is free, right? There's a cost for this and what we're willing to do. I like the way you defined it, which is the conversation is more about boundaries now, which is where does that boundary happen? But that has a lot to do with the individual's assertiveness and their ability to communicate that boundary and request, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to me, it's sort of raising this big question of what does healthy ambition mean right now, right? Because people of older generations, ambition meant like you put in your time, you move up, you put in the extra work, and now I think it's up for debate what healthy amounts of ambition are, and work-life balance. I mean, I had this insight about a year or two ago that I think this idea of balance the metaphor is a bit outdated. And so my new theory, you can tell me if you think it's silly, but my new theory is that everything we do in life falls into one of three buckets: want, should, and need. So whether we say it implicitly or explicitly, every time we do something, there is in effect, I want to do this, I should do this, or I need to do this, which is a close cousin. I have to do this. Right. And I think one of the ways to come at the work-life balance conversation in a new way is to do a self-assessment, which is how much of what you're doing falls into you want to do it, you should do it, or you need to do it. And to me, that framework sort of transcends, is it work or life, right? Because ideally, hopefully, there's something that you do at work that you want to do because you enjoy doing it and it's rewarding. But just like in our personal lives, there's things we want to do, we should do, we need to.
Right.
The same is true as in work. And I think people are happier when they feel like there's a good distribution of those pieces of the pie chart of want, should, and need. And usually if somebody's like really unhappy in their job, because like it's a very small piece of the want pie.
Right. And to that point, like maybe they're putting too much eggs in the one basket, which is there isn't that balance and that focus in life, which I'm getting fulfilled in other areas. Right. Quiet quitting. What's so funny about the world that we live in is corporate loves, and I find it's an annual thing. There's a new term annually, right? Began with, let's go all the way back to generations. And then that was a big topic in training, right? Like generational leadership. And then it was all about, being a coach and being a mentor, right? What's the difference between that? And then it was about facilitative leadership. And, now like corporate comes up with these words, and they've come up with quiet quitting. Someone said this to me. They were like, you realize quiet quitting's been going on forever. No one rolls into the office and bangs on the table and says, I am unhappy, I will be quitting in 6 months, right? We fudge through it. We quietly look for opportunity on the side and stuff. So quietly quitting isn't a new thing. It's just something that we've defined, right? I think what I also heard you talking a lot about is people's inability to deal with stress. And we live in a very stressful world, and leadership is stressful, and business is stressful, and coming back to the office is stressful. All of these things are stressful. And we've progressed in life where, yes, things have become easier, and maybe we've swung a little too far. Maybe that's part of the issue that we're dealing with now with teams and employees, is an unwillingness to feel the pinch, the stress. What are your thoughts about that?
To me, it does go back to leadership, because first of all, I agree with you, right? I think there's a little bit of a reset of like, well, how much stress am I supposed to feel, right? And how bad am I supposed to feel, and psychological safety and all these. There seems to be a growing awareness. Companies and people are much more open about the mental health conversation, all of which is good. Right. But companies do need to grow, and we grow as individuals through stress, right? Hopefully the good kind of stress rather than the bad kind of stress. And I think, in the context of work, again, have you got 10 hours to talk through this? But I think, I am often struck and reminded by like the fact, I think there's just too many bad bosses in the world still.
Agreed.
Right. Yeah. And having a bad boss is the number one source of stress. Right? Because they affect you like day to day in your interaction with them. I think having bad leaders is also a source of stress, not because of the personal interactions, but if they feel like the values are in conflict with how people actually live. And wait a minute, you're telling me that's important? You just promoted the high performing jerk who likes to throw phones behind closed doors. So you're telling me we have like all these contradictions. So I just think ultimately it goes back to leadership. The best companies, to create that healthy level of stress, to me, I think it starts at the top with a clear strategy so that people come into work, they know what they're doing, they know the plan to win, that is linked to the mission, purpose, and values. Because I think those need to be integrated more than they ever have been. It was okay before if the strategy and that like we were separate conversations. So now there has to be this like collective whole of like, this is who we are and this is where we're going. These are our values, and the leadership lives those values. And there's never any wavering from that. I think that creates a sense of certainty and makes people more up for the healthy kind of stress of, okay, how do we grow? How do we pivot? It's interesting that one of the you made a point earlier, which I completely agree with, and all the research shows that people don't like change, right? They find it stressful. In our work with leadership teams, sometimes I'll put up this slide. It's just got a line down the middle, and on each side, on one side it says what is going to change, and the other side is what is not going to change. And it is remarkable to me how clarifying and helpful that conversation is. Because people are under a fair amount of stress. And if you say, okay, everybody, let's talk about what is not going to change. Ideally, it's like broadly our mission, purpose, values, our strategy. We've got a pretty clear one. We're going to pivot and stuff, but it's pretty clear. So that stuff is not who we are, and what we do is not going to change. So you can relax about that. But now let's talk about how we're going to do it, and changing our processes and adopting this new technology. So to me, like that's how you create an environment that balances the change and not change.
It's a cool exercise, right? Or it gives people perspective.
Yeah.
Right. Super cool. Very, very, very cool. So on the note of purpose, right? Some of the best leaders I know had this conversation before corporate even butchered it and started to coin it. We're coming up and we're living and driving what was known as purpose-driven strategies, which was the alignment of values and mission and strategy all in sort of one box, which is here's what we stand for and here's how we're going to win. And I got to credit, his name is TC. He's the CEO. We've worked with him. I've worked with his organizations for years, and this is 10 years ago. And I had him on the podcast actually. And that's what he started to really drive a lot of his leadership through. And if you look 10 years later, if you look at the organization, doesn't matter who you speak to in the organization. If you ask them what the purpose of the organization is, what's the strategy of the organization, how does their purpose and values align with that, they'll rhyme it right off. How important is it for us to start to move the conversation into purpose-driven strategy, and maybe dropping the conversation of culture and focusing on the conversation of community?
Yeah, so I've got thoughts on purpose, and like you have watched with interest as over the last few years. I think during the Great Resignation, when everybody was sitting at home and doing like, what's my purpose, right, and having a lot of sort of Hamlet-like conversations with ourselves, that companies stepped into that void to provide more of a sense of purpose. They started appointing chief purpose officers and either rewriting or kind of relaunching their purpose statements. And so we all watched that trend, and it built on a long-term trend. I mean, if you ever watched that HBO series Silicon Valley, there was a funny moment where they had a pitch contest, and all these like highly technical startups, and at the end of every single one of them, the founder said, "And make the world a better place," right? And which was just sort of poking fun. And it's interesting because I think a lot of purpose statements do go up to that altitude of just some version of make the world a better place. So I have healthy skepticism is kind of my approach to the purpose conversations. And here's why, because I get why companies are doing it. And I think it's good. And there's a need for it. But I think there's going to be an evolution over time. And the reason is that when you think about purpose, it is about narrative and it is about intent. So a company or an individual says, this is my purpose, right? This is our purpose. I'm creating a narrative, and I'm also telling you what my intention is, right? If I get up in the morning, my intent is to make the world a better place.
Right.
My prediction is that the conversation is going to move over time to impact, because impact is not about intent or narrative. It is about actions and facts.
Cool.
And because it's one thing to say, make the world a better place, but then the second beat is, well, how are you doing that? What resources are you putting against it? How are you measuring progress on whether you are making the world a better place? So I think there's been this sense of like people have welcomed companies caring about more than just returning another penny to shareholders. But I feel like the conversation is still in like the teenage years, because when business is at its best, it is fully accountable and fully transparent, and it's based on numbers and reports and documents and facts, rather than just we don't want companies to be like politicians, because politicians could say anything. They are always talking about narrative and intent.
Their purpose.
Right. So to me, that's my little crystal ball, and we'll see if I'm right or not.
It's probably one of the smartest things I've heard in a long time, specifically in the world that we live in. Yeah, I think you're 1,000% correct. And I like the way you describe that, which is like purpose is like in its teenagehood, right? It's not fully developed, right? We still gotta build it and eventually turn into that adult, which is impact, and the importance of organizations operating with transparency and accountability, which, sometimes is farther few few than between. Is that now farther? Who knows? I'm butchering the line.
I'm with you.
Hopefully the audience is with me as well. Love
few and far between is what you're
few and far between. Thank you. Surprised I actually interview and I host a podcast sometimes, right? Tell me about, let's jump into your book. Your new book is called The Leap to Leader, How Ambitious Managers Make the Jump to Leadership. You've been published by Harvard Business Review. After our conversation, we might ask, why? Why would you want to go from manager to leader? But tell us a little bit about the book. What's it covering? What are some of the lessons and the points that we're making out of it?
Sure. So I've organized it into 4 sections. The first one is to ask the provocative question, do you really want to lead? And I italicized the word really because I think a lot of people say, yeah, I want that promotion. Like I want to be a leader, but they haven't really reckoned with what they're getting into. The fact that people are incredibly complicated and all the challenges of leadership. I don't need to tell you, it is really hard and it is a lot harder than a lot of people think. And some people just say, yeah, I want the bigger title, or they want the money, or, some sense of power. And so I think what I try and do in that first section is really hold up a mirror. And so people can say, like, is this really what you want? And if it is what you want, be really clear on why you want it, like really do the internal work and the excavation. So you're clear on your motivations and that you're not surprised, because it is really hard. People are really complicated. The decisions get harder, the weight on your back. I mean, I could go on and on. The second section is first be a great manager, because I think before you become a leader, can become a great leader, you have to be a great manager. And that's increasingly the proving ground for future leaders. I think there was a day and age where you could be a bad manager and still get promoted because there was a tolerance of phone throwers in companies and yellers and misogynists and all those other things. I think you can't really do that anymore. At least I'd like to think so. Right. The third section is kind of like my career advice for mid-professionals, not for college grads. But if you want to be a leader, you've got to move up quickly to a position of impact, right? And I frame that as like, how do you win promotions without asking for them? How do you set yourself apart? And then finally, what is the leap to leader? What is the mindset shift? One of the areas I like to focus on there is just this idea of like, who are you as a leader? And part of the context for me is that we are taught at a young age, and as we're moving into our careers, like you always got to have your elevator pitch ready, right? What if you're on an elevator with a boss and they said, what are you doing? Like, what are you working on? Or what do you want to do, right? You got to have your elevator pitch ready. And what has struck me is that people are generally not taught to have an answer for a question that somebody might ask them, which is, who are you as a leader? And I think, to me, the best answer is, the magical rule of 3, maybe 4, but to be able to say, look, these are the things that are really important to me as a leader. My 3 values, this is what they mean to me. And I want to tell you some stories about how they became important to me. And now I want to tell you about why, in my experience managing, leading teams, I have seen these be really important drivers of success. So that's what you need to know about me as a leader. And I think all that plays into really important qualities of executive presence, authenticity, just this sense of like you're comfortable in your own skin, you know who you are. I feel you can look at somebody in the eye and just tell whether they're comfortable with who they are. And a lot of that comes with self-awareness. So that's just an example of what, to me, it means to make that leap to leader, is just be clear about like, well, just the simple answer to that question, or the hard answer to the simple question of who are you as a leader?
Yeah, that's great advice. And not many people think about that, right? Which is where does this sit with me, and how does this translate into the organization and my impact? Again, the word impact has popped up again, and I think that's a huge component of leadership. For the audience, what in your mind is the main differences between a manager and a leader?
To be a manager is somebody whose job it is to fulfill expectations, right? They are given a certain amount of resources, time, money, people, et cetera, and said, this is the expected outcome we have of you. Now, please manage these resources efficiently. And to me, a leader is somebody who sees the possibilities, who challenges the conventional thinking, the status quo, and has the courage to place bets. And sees it more broadly. So again, we could talk for hours about the difference, but to me, like, that's the biggest difference. It's like, give me the playbook or I'm going to write the playbook. Like, that's to me kind of the break point.
Awesome. You mentioned some capabilities or competencies, authenticity, the ability to make an impact, to self-awareness. Are there any others that, people can start to think about when it comes down to developing themselves?
Yeah, and I think there's an underappreciated superpower of leadership, which is listening. Listening is not taught as a course in business schools. Typically, I haven't found any, but I think it's something that really separates the very best leaders. And it seems increasingly like a rare skill these days. Maybe it's because we're all living on our phones or devices, but I think most conversations feel like serial monologues, right? Like people are just waiting for the other person to stop talking so they can tell you what they're thinking. Right. And I think being a good leader, good listener helps you in all contexts as a leader, not only in one-on-one. People want to feel like they're heard and listened to. People want to feel that they're respected, and the best way to show somebody respect is to listen to them and really try and understand what they're saying. So it happens. It's important one-on-one and with teams, but also like the higher you move up in an organization, you need to be aware of the fact that all the information that's coming to you is compromised, right? Because you become the CEO, it's like everybody, oh, everything's great, boss, man. And by the way, did you lose weight? Because you look awesome, right?
Right.
And just so there's this contradiction of being the CEO where you have access to more lines of communication than anybody else, and yet all of them are more compromised than anybody else is getting. So you have to create this sort of listening ecosystem infrastructure to make sure that you are getting good signals. I wrote the CEO test, my last book it was the only book I wrote with a co-author, Kevin Scherer, the former CEO of Amgen. And he started this practice with his annual pulse surveys of the employees. He would just open field at the end of the survey and say, what do you think of the job that Kevin is doing? And, he said he would gather all those and pour himself an adult beverage and read them one night. But like, you need to do things like that so that you know what the critics are saying, you know what the problems are, because history is filled with examples of stuff that was happening down in the organizations and the message never got up to the boss.
Correct. There's that show Undercover Boss, which is a perfect example of that. They go and they work the front line. It's like, I had no idea this was happening, right?
Exactly.
That was very wise what you said there, which is the further we go in regards to leadership or seniority, like a CEO, the more compromised our communication lines coming into us are, because people are censored and, people do operate with caution and people do learn to communicate things in a specific way so it lands in a certain way. I talk about this as salespeople, but you've just given me something that's not just salespeople. Salespeople will come to their sales leader and they'll have the greatest story on why they closed the deal. To climb the mountain barefoot and swing from a tree, and they had to create a spear, but they killed it and they hunted it and they brought the deal in, and they will have that same level of story on why the deal didn't close. Right? Exactly. Let me teach you something about listening. I think you're going to like this. So this actually comes from a debriefing model, which is psychology, which is when someone's gone through a traumatic event and they're in therapy and they're going through the process of talking, why or how do they go through that process successfully? And it has everything to do with listening. Now, the problem as human beings, and as you said earlier, we don't listen. Even though corporate folks, leaders that have gone and done active listening courses, and I'm not sure if you teach listening, but maybe you'll change the model. The reason we don't listen well is because of who we are as personalities. And when we listen through 4 quadrants. And again, we do all 4. And we've done all 4. We've listened in all 4 styles in different relationships. If we're a parent, if we're a leader, if we're a friend, if we're a spouse, depending on that relationship and who we are as a personality determines what my ears turn into. And the first quadrant is the quadrant of judgment and criticism. And I'm sure you've done this when someone's coming, they're talking to you and they're telling you a story and you're going, oh, here we go again. Why am I not surprised that you effed it up, right? Now, sometimes we say these things, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes we're just listening through the criticism and the judgment. So, it becomes danger that we're not even getting our communication lines coming in. But the worst thing is we're now acting and role modeling and behaving in a way which can create problems for future communication and lines and listening. Second thing we do is when we listen, we minimize. So someone's telling us something and we're leaping it. It's okay. Don't worry about it. We're jumping it, right? Third thing we do, guys love to do this. We problem solve. Someone's coming and they're talking to us. We're like, all right, here's what you got to do. First thing you got to do is you got to pour yourself an adult beverage. Then you got to read the feedback. Yeah. And the fourth thing we do is we interrupt. And the danger in all of this is if we're not aware we're doing this, we're literally teaching people to do the same thing. So listening in both ways. All right, my friend, at the end of the episode, we come to the most important question. Actually, before we go there, if people want to learn more about your stuff, XCO, your books, where can they go check this out?
Sure. Our website for my firm is XCO Leadership, EXCO leadership.com. And my personal website is Adam Bryant Books, all one word.com.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, I have to ask this, what began the journey of authoring?
I never expected to write books. Everything started on this part of my career with a simple what if question, which is what if I sat down with CEOs and never asked them about their companies? And that's what launched the Corner Office series I did at the New York Times. And honestly, there was a little bit of skepticism when I launched it. Like, is this really going to work? Do you think they'll have anything to say? And everything just flows from that. And you interview 100, 200, and just as I kept interviewing more people, my only skill in life is pattern recognition. I started noticing patterns, and it's like, oh, there's some insights here. And actually, there's some frameworks for how to think about whether it's culture or the 7 key tests that all leaders face, which is what the CEO test is about. And so that's how the book's evolved.
Cool. And then, since you brought it up, what are the 7 tests?
Sure. So the first one is, can you develop a simple plan for your strategy, right? And again, we could talk about that for hours, but I think that simple word strategy is really problematic because it means different things to different people. Can you build teams that are real teams? Another one is around culture. How do you build an effective culture? Can you drive transformation? Can you really listen? Can you handle a crisis? And the last chapter is a little bit more about the internal work of around the paradoxes of leadership and how do you think about those? So we frame that book around, it's like, okay, why do people succeed or fail in leadership jobs? And let's say there's 300 reasons, but if you can boil them down, what are the 7 core reasons? So one thing is to identify the tests, and then just using a lot of my stories and insights and frameworks, try to provide the playbook for, okay, how do you actually navigate those tests?
Cool. Very cool. Super, super interested to check this out. And your new book, The Leap to Leader, comes out July 13th, 2023? 11th.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. All right. But it's in a couple months. Very exciting. Are you going to have a big book launch?
Maybe I am Canadian. So and I'm an introvert. So, I don't like being the center of attention, but
yeah, well, maybe you got to take the spotlight for a little bit. I think you got a lot of messaging and words of wisdoms to share out there. So awesome. All right. At the end of the episode, we come to the most important question, which is the better human question, which is, what do you think we all could do to be better humans tomorrow? But I'm going to change that for you. I'm going to say, what do you think we could all do to be better leaders tomorrow?
And to me, it's the answer is the same for both humans, both leaders. So I like to, sometimes when I'm working with groups, I like to ask 2 questions. The first one is, who is the best listener you know in your circle of friends, family, colleagues? Across your entire, who is the best listener you know? And then we have a discussion about, okay, well, why are they good listeners? Let's share some of the tactics and, the fact they don't judge and all that. And then we have that full discussion. I run a session on how to be a better listener. And at the very end, I asked this question. I said, okay, let's say magically, I could reach out to everybody in the audience here and talk to everybody in your networks, your friends, families, and colleagues. And I asked them the question, who is the best listener you know? And then my challenge to the audience members is, would they say it's you?
Smart.
And to me, it is a lifelong skill. It is a muscle you can build every single moment of every single day in every relationship you have. But the crazy runaway bonus points is that it separates leaders just like all day long, right? The very best leaders are very good listeners. There are some people, whether it's Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos, who are kind of maniacally focused on their vision, and they are right. But yes. Exactly. But for most of us mere mortals, it's like, you got to be a good listener. And it's increasingly important in this era where it's like, the good question is worth 10x the good answer in this environment. And so you've always got to be trying to figure out like what's the question we're not asking that we should be.
Right. And that's where great listening comes from is the questions we ask.
Yeah.
Right. Very cool. Simon Sinek, you'll like this. I'm sure you might have heard it. Simon Sinek says, there's two reasons why you want to let everyone else go first. So why you want to listen to everyone in the room. It says, number one, everyone feels heard. Number two, you get to hear everyone's answer first before sharing yours. And it's wise. Yep. Adam Bryant, I've had a lot of fun having this conversation, just because I'm in the world with you as well. Could have geeked out with you for another several hours, but we got to cap it. I don't think the audience could hang on, but we might have to do a part 2 to this. Super appreciate your time.
Thank you.
For the audience, go check out www.adambryantbooks.com, just the way it sounds. We're going to have this all in the show notes as well. If you're interested in his company, go check out the XCO group. That's EXCO group. I'm sure we could reach out to you on LinkedIn. I connected with you on LinkedIn and you seem to respond well, so people can DM you and reach out. Go check out more of his work. When his book comes out, go pick it up. Where's it going to be launching? Where can people pick it up on your website and Amazon, or just your website?
Yeah, Amazon and any bookseller should have it. Yeah.
Amazing. All right, to the audience, stay happy, stay healthy. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to share. Don't forget to like, and we will see you next time.